Hey there everybody, Andy Perry here with Anderson Perry & Associates to talk about the top 5 risky mistakes that I have seen local public agencies make when they are hiring an engineer. For the sake of the discussion today, when I refer to an engineer, I am usually referring to a consulting engineering firm and not necessarily meaning a specific person or individual. From my experience, I recognize that most of you likely do not take the lead role on hiring consulting engineers, but I am confident that most of you are involved at arm's length in the process that your agency goes through when they hire a consulting engineering firm. You're probably reviewing RFPs or helping put the RFP together or helping with some specifications and like. I recognize that the topic may seem to be a little less on the exciting side, but I do hope to share a few ideas with you that you may take back to your various organizations to help make the process of hiring and working with a consulting engineering firm more productive and rewarding for your organization. To start off with, I've got a few videos of some projects that have failed just for your entertainment purposes. Let's take a look.
We all remember what it felt like seeing that video. Today marks 1 year since the horrific scene at the Hard Rock Hotel construction site when the top floors of the 18-story building collapsed. Good evening, I'm Sharice Gibson.
And I'm Karen Swenson. The Hard Rock collapse killed 3 workers who were trapped inside.
Almost immediately afterwards, eyewitness investigator David Hammer started to uncover what might have caused this terrible tragedy. He joins us now from the Hard Rock site. David, hard to believe it's been 1 year.
Yeah, Sharice and Karen, it's very loud here because there's a memorial going up to the 3 workers who were killed in that collapse. And big news just moments ago, the owners of the Hard Rock Hotel site, 1031 Canal Development, and their lead owner, Mohan Kailas, sued their contractors and alleged that they're responsible for the collapse. Of course, we investigated what went wrong, and we discovered that there were problems with support beams on those upper floors, including the steel beams that supported those floors, and also changes to the metal decking where they poured the concrete. We also broke the story of this video shot by one of the workers just days before the collapse. In it, he said in Spanish that the building was poorly designed and pointed out a shoring support that was buckling under the weight of the 17th floor above. We've also seen several problems getting the building down over the last year. It started with demolition of tower cranes damaged during the collapse, and it continued with a battle between the owners, 1031 Canal Development, and the city over the best way to bring it down. City Chief Administrative Officer Gilbert Montano today said he's frustrated.
This is Minneapolis in the American Midwest, on the banks of the Mississippi River. On August 1st, 2007, it became the site of one of the most shocking engineering failures in American history. At 6:05 that evening, Lindsay Peterson was driving home from work across the Interstate 35 West Bridge.
I usually took that route. I mean, it was very common for me to take 35. My job is right off of 35, and my home is right off of 35.
Lindsay found herself in slow-moving traffic in the middle of the bridge when there was a sudden noise.
I actually heard this really distinct sound of metal snapping, and within seconds after that, I was falling.
The bridge had given way beneath her.
I thought that I was gonna die as soon as I landed. I thought I would land on the cement or something and it would smash me like a pancake.
There was a team of construction workers on the bridge at the time of the collapse. Nothing alerted them to what was about to happen.
I was moving a piece of equipment and the bridge started to shake, which it normally does when a heavy semi goes across or whatever, and it shook, and then all of a sudden it just fell out from underneath us.
Jeff was driving an earth mover when he fell more than 30 meters.
I mean, there wasn't really anything you could do or nowhere to go. You couldn't run or do anything. So I bounced off the piece of equipment that I was on and then cartwheeled off into the water.
Stage by stage, the bridge was collapsing.
The north end of the bridge buckled up 40, 50 feet in the air, slab by slab, like a snake, coming right at me. And it just looked like a monster, the way it took cars and it would buckle up and cars would be suspended in the air and then come back down on the bridge. And when it got to me, my slab, it lifted me up. And I remember looking out over everybody, and then I heard a boom. It was the bridge coming down, and then just 1-2 seconds later, the whole bridge just went down. And I remember screaming out loud, "No, no, no," and I truly thought that was the day I was gonna die.
News. A pedestrian bridge that has fallen, and you can see a lot of rubble. They're zooming in on one of those vehicles that was crushed. And again, we want to be very sensitive to the situation because we don't know whether people are still inside that vehicle or if there are people underneath that bridge who are trapped as well. But there are rescuers from the Miami-Dade Fire and Rescue Crew there trying to help those people who may be involved in this situation, and they'll continue to assess the scene. We will also, of course, get more information and bring that to you just as soon as we have it. Again, from Florida International University. We'll take a quick...
It's never a good sign when your project ends up on the news, and while few of us are involved in such large-scale projects, none of us want to be involved in difficult projects, or especially projects that fail where possibly somebody is hurt or injured or killed. There are countless ramifications when something serious goes wrong with a large or small public infrastructure project. Loss of life, loss of property, short and long-term environmental impacts, loss of public trust, loss of other financial impacts, or having the financial impacts that go along with a project that fails. The only actual winners seem to be the lawyers, and from what I've been told, lawyers are only slightly more evil than consulting engineers. Well, folks, that's about as funny as I can get. So none of us want to be involved in projects that fail, and so one of the best ways I've seen in nearly doing this for 20 years is getting started off on the right foot, and that's kind of what I'm here to talk about today. So as we get started today, I thought I'd lead off with a few terms just so that we all stay on the same page here. I talk a lot about local public agencies. And what I mean by that is more of a small local public agency. Not everything that I'll say today will necessarily apply to large public agencies such as ODOT or City of Portland or that sort of thing. So kind of keep that in mind when I'm talking about local public agencies. I mean probably more the cities, the counties, that sort of thing that are in rural Eastern Oregon. So, and then like I mentioned before, when I refer to an engineer, I mean consulting engineering firm, architectural firm, or surveying firm. Most of what I'll talk about today are the ways that you go about hiring these folks is the same for the architects and the surveyors as well, and a lot of the laws and the regulations and rules around hiring these folks are all the same for engineers, architects, and surveying firms. So also talk a lot about RFPs, and when I mean RFP, that means a request for proposal, not meaning a request for price. They're two very different things, and so today when I'm talking about things, though, I mean request for proposals. Contractor. This is one that gets confusing a lot because your lawyers will put your agreements together and call engineers contractors or surveyors contractors. Yes, we may be contracting with the city, but for the sake of discussions today, when I say contractor, I mean this is a company who builds projects. This is a guy that has bulldozers, or a company that has bulldozers and dump trucks and moves dirt and puts pipe in the ground and does that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by contractor, and I don't want to get that confused with what sometimes the lawyers think contractors are with respect to you're contracting with the city. The other issue today, or the thing I want to talk about, is fee, and I'll talk about that because in the engineering, surveying, architecture world, we don't necessarily, when we talk about what we charge for our services, we don't often talk about it as a price. We talk about it more as a fee. mostly because that comes into conflict a lot with, how much does it cost me to build this treatment plant? You're looking for a cost or a price, and we separate call it a fee as opposed to talk about it more. It's an hourly rate. It's a service rather than something that you necessarily go buy off the shelf. So just bring that up, and again, just get my plug in on the lawyers, folks who are slightly just like more than consultants, right? As I was preparing for this, I went and searched for project failures and engineering failures in Google. I was pretty surprised to find a lot of things. It was pretty interesting, to say the least. There's lots of different photos, and some of them I'm not sure if they were real or if they were not. I'm pretty sure this this one up here, this third photo, is doctored a little bit. At least I certainly would hoped it was. I'm not sure exactly how in the world some of these things got built, but I think we've all in our respective careers come across some things that we've shook our head with. I wanted to pause right here for a second and kind of say, while I'm obviously biased as far as the importance of engineering goes with respect to projects, and also biased with respect to AP, I know that AP is not always the right engineer for the job. And while we are certainly qualified, there's a lot of other firms out there that are just as qualified as AP is. And so what I want to do today is just kind of go through some of the insights that I've learned or seen as I've helped or been involved in the process of local public agencies procuring their engineer. So ultimately, the projects that you work on can be more of a success, can be less challenging to get started, to get constructed, and certainly more important, less challenging to operate and maintain, because that's what you folks do. So when things go wrong, we all get to play the blame game, right? If you ask the contractor, it's generally the engineer's fault. If you ask the engineer, it's generally the contractor's fault. If you ask the owner, it's everyone else's fault. And it's the operations staff in the end who get to deal with all the headaches of a project that may not have gotten constructed as originally desired or hoped, because it was more than likely the operational staff that helped get the project going because of the needs that they had. So, well, whose fault really is it? Well, if you don't ask the lawyers, and we're real honest, everyone to some degree shares in the blame when a project fails. Depending on the situation, I acknowledge that some more than others, and also acknowledge here that certainly engineers are not perfect, and we do make mistakes, and those mistakes need to be fixed. But we all know that it is much harder to fix issues after they are constructed, and in my opinion, one of the best ways to avoid playing or having to play the blame game during a project or at the end of a project is taking some extra care when you are going about hiring that consulting engineering firm at the very beginning of the project. I've always enjoyed this next illustration. I thought you guys would get a kick out of it, at least I do. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but if I can make it work here. Right, this is how operations explained what they wanted. This is how city officials understood it, right? This is how it was sold to the public. This was how, of course, the engineer designed it. And this doesn't surprise us. This is what the project budget looked like. This is how much the project actually costed. This is how the project was documented. This is what the contractor built. And this is what operations really needed. And I think we can all relate with that to some extent, because this is kind of how we feel like the process goes through. And if the points of communication aren't set up right at the beginning of a project, and time isn't taken to be sure that what you're asking for and what the various players are hearing what you're asking for, we can kind of run into this situation. And in the end, no one's happy. So the key, actually, in my impression, starts up really right up here, right? It's how and really deciding what you want and what you can afford. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you start right, the chances of ending right certainly improve. Once you kind of got your arms around what you're hoping to accomplish with your project, or what problems you're trying to solve, the next step really is, or often is, hiring your engineer to help you start to develop your idea or concept into something that can actually be constructed. And ideally, you want to hire somebody with experience that can help make it as the project as smoothly as possible, and make it successful. It's when you get this step wrong, in my opinion, that it really messes up with, or really adds to that process that we looked at in the last slide. My grandfather built houses here in the valley in the La Grande area for many, many years, and I can often recall him saying that if you don't get your foundation right, then you will fight the problems all the way to the roof. And I don't know that I really appreciated that statement until I tried to tackle the task of building my own home about 15 years ago. And not paying somebody to build it, but actually taking a large part in active role in actually pounding the nails and making it happen. And I can honestly say I know exactly what Grandpa meant when he was talking about that. I've also seen that to be the case over the nearly past 17 years in working with public agencies and cities, and seeing large infrastructure projects, that when it doesn't get off right to start with, it ends up being one of those fights that you fight it all the way through, and it never ends up being very fun. So let's kind of talk about what happens when if you don't get that consultant right. We've seen them, obviously the project fails, but let's specifically talk about some of the challenges that you might run into if you don't get the right consulting engineering firm on board. So let's talk about what happens when to your project when you get the wrong consulting engineering firm. And wrong means wrong for you, and wrong for the project, whatever that means. Because this really comes down to more of what the right engineer looks like for you. So first of all, as I've seen it, the project will likely cost more money to construct, and I'll also throw more money to operate in there as well. The construction process is likely going to be contentious and possibly involve litigation. Lawyers, we know how that plays out. They're the ones that only win. Construction's going to probably take longer, which translates into more headaches, more stress, and more cost. When all's said and done, increased operations and maintenance costs. Operations are maybe complicated and require more qualified staff. Operational headaches and unhappy staff, which is not a good thing. We get to go in and play the blame game, and no one wins there except the lawyers. You end up with unhappy councils or boards, or the public especially. You end up in the newspaper, right? Worst case is you end up on the 6 o'clock news. Your public agency has increased liability exposure. Limited long-term support from your engineer. If you hire one that maybe isn't from around here. They come in, they do the project, they leave, they're done. You don't have access to that person anymore, and ultimately a failed project. And these are all the things that we want to avoid when we head off on getting a project started. Alright, so finally, we're about not quite halfway through this, and we're finally getting to the real meat of this. So, these are my top 5 mistakes that I see local public agencies make when they are trying to hire an engineering firm. The first and foremost is that the local public agency doesn't follow or understand the federal or state laws that govern procurement for professional services, specifically consulting engineers. There is specific language both at the federal level and at least in the state of Oregon, also the state of Washington, and many others that specify the steps that you must go through to properly hire your engineer. And it's significantly different than what general public contracting is, that revolve around asking for a bid. And unfortunately, the local public agencies are led astray by their lawyers. They just don't understand the differences. They don't read on, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But that's where most of them get led astray. The other place that I've seen public agencies get led astray significantly in the process of as far as understanding the rules are listening to funding agency personnel. And not to throw those folks under the bus at all, but they don't know the laws any better or any worse than your lawyers, and it's usually a lot less. So they understand some aspects of it, but not all of it. And so that's where I think many times public agencies get led astray, is because they believe that the funding agency has specific requirements when it's really the laws that oversee the way that oversee how those funds are spent, and that the funding agencies don't dictate in most cases how you need to procure your professional services or your engineer. Okay, the next one I see is local public agencies really don't take advantage of the RFP process. They view it as a pain. They view it as kind of, in some cases, a hurdle or red tape or an impediment to getting their system started or getting their project started, something they have to do. When, if you dive into the process and really understand what you can do and how you can make it about your project, there are some real advantages, and you can learn a lot about how to avoid some of those pitfalls that we talked about earlier if you really understand and take advantage of the process. The next one is local public agencies often get just focused on the cost of engineering. And they want to bid. I mean, they're used to bidding everything else out. They're used to dealing with low bidder, and that doesn't work in many cases for when you're trying to get the right engineer. You want to get the most qualified one, the one that's going to be able to understand what you need, what you want, create the balance, and making sure that it gets done right. So that's a big one that I see folks struggle with. I mean, simply because that's how we evaluate everything, is how much does it cost, right? The next one I see, and I'll talk more about these as we get into it, but the next one I see is that local public agencies, because they don't necessarily like the RFP process, issue very vague and inconsistent RFPs. It's the old copy and paste, or I'll get it from the last project, or I'll get it from my buddy down the street, and they copy and paste it. And many of the criteria, the things you're asking for, the scope of the project, are all very, very vague and hard to understand. And so it becomes very difficult for us as consulting engineers to respond to the RFPs, which it makes it problematic for you, is it makes it very difficult for you to review and rank and really understand how to select the engineer that's absolutely best for your project, or that's the most qualified for your project. And the last one I see is that many times the local public agency failed to generate significant interest before issuing the RFP. And we'll talk about some ways that you can get some interest developed during that process. You can learn a lot about your project. You can learn a lot about how much it may cost to construct that project. You'll learn about how long it may take to construct the project, and you'll even learn roughly what it may take to design, or how much it may cost to design that project, all before you ever issue the RFP. So there are a couple of federal and state laws that I'll talk about today. The first one we'll talk about is the Brooks Act. This is an act that was done in 1972, and it applies to the federal agencies and to any projects that use any kind of federal funding. So projects that come through rural development and other funding agencies where the money's originated from the feds, this law would in fact govern how you go about procuring your engineer. The other one is respect to Oregon, and many states have their own QBS laws. So when a project doesn't have public or federal funds, and it has it's funded by state dollars, then at least in Oregon, the procurement rules are laid out in the ORS 279C 110 and the OARs 137-48. Now, many times, as I've alluded to, the public procurement general contracting laws are the OARs 137-47, and that's kind of where people get stuck, and they don't move on to realize that in fact there is a whole nother section that applies to just engineers, surveyors, and architects. As I mentioned, these laws are often referred to as the qualification-based selection laws, or QBS, and they require or kind of outline how the RFP process is to go, so that qualifications are considered when public agencies are hiring their engineers. I'm not going to go into many of the details of each of these laws, but they're really not hard to understand if you just go take a look at them. And like I said earlier, I found that most legal counsel for small public agencies are just not aware of these laws, as they are very much aware of the laws, at least in Oregon, the general low bid public contracting laws like laid out in OAR 137-47. The main difference with the laws is just that the role that price plays in the procurement. Obviously, in general public contracting low bid, price takes a lead. You ask, I want this service, and tell me, you ask 4 or 5 contractors to give you a bid. The main difference here is that these laws say, instead of engineers give me a bid, they're asking for you to give a proposal and to allow you to first make an initial selection based on the qualifications. There's really no QBS or police that are going to come knock down your door if these rules aren't followed. The problem is if the project ends up encountering problems and you didn't procure your engineer appropriately, it leaves the local public agency more liable, and it also may invalidate your engineer's liability insurance. So these rules require that the local public agency use the RFP process to select, screen, and rank consultants based on the qualifications that are important to the agency for their particular project. And these could change from project to project, or the type of other reasons that you may be wanting to hire your consultant. So some of the most common qualifications that people use to rank are, first, experience and expertise. So what similar projects have they completed, what their education and background looks like, what specialized training they have had. Obviously, the number of similar projects that they've completed would be a very important qualification to consider. The next one you see a lot is availability. So how soon or how much staff is able to work on your project at a given time. This one's a tough one because in most cases, if you ask any consultant if they have time, they're always going to tell you that they will. So ultimately, how you go about assessing the availability of the staff in a RFP is a little challenging. I've seen people ask for the percent that of time that your project manager is available. I've seen them ask for a list of current assignments for project managers so that you can try to guess ultimately if somebody's proposing with a project manager that has 15 projects on their plate, they're probably not going to be able to dedicate as much time to your project initially, and so you can determine, based on how quickly you want the project to kick off, how important that is to you. I've found, and we'll get into this a little later, that the easiest way to identify availability is really the firm's ability to meet and keep commitments, and so that can really mostly can be followed up in references, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next one, as kind of goes along with experience and expertise, is, like I mentioned, the training and education part. What degrees they need, and specifically specialized training. To maintain your engineering license, your professional engineering license, you have to have ongoing continuing education credits, just like you folks do for while you're sitting through this ever so exciting presentation. So do your engineers. And so what does that training look like? And more specifically, ask them, how is that training applicable to the project that you're currently wanting to get started? And kind of along the lines on the other side with availability is really references. Talk to people, ask people. Ask your consulting engineers in the proposal to list some references that are not going to necessarily give you good ones. We all have them. We all had projects that haven't gone well. We've all had expectations that weren't met. So, I would ask your consulting engineer in your RFP one to maybe list a couple references that aren't going to give you good reference, won't provide a good reference, or for a reference that a project that didn't go well. And if they're not going to give you one, that in my case, I would suggest that would be a red flag, because we all have them. Some other things that you could consider in your RFP that may be important to you is the lead office location. Do you want your engineering team, or specifically your project manager, to be able to be on site? Do you want to be able to work with them in person as much as possible? That may be important to you, that may not be important to you, based on the type of project it is. If it's a simpler, straightforward project, that may not be a big deal. If it's a more complicated project and there's a lot of public involvement and a lot of council involvement, you may want that your project manager a little closer. as you know, ties along with that, where's the office, but ultimately, where does your project manager live? You know, you could have, you know, a project manager in LeGrand, or an office in LeGrand, but your project manager is going to be out of Boise. That may not be ideal for your situation. It may work out just fine. As I mentioned, the experience and expertise of a lot of times, as when we're putting proposals together, we'll talk about the experience and expertise of the firm, which can be fairly broad, especially if you're working with a firm that's or getting proposals from a firm that's very large. But I would specifically ask in your RFPs about your project manager's applicable experience. What projects have they done, and how recent were they, and how similar were they to what you're trying to do? Because more than likely they've learned from each one of their projects ways to help you save money, ways to help your project operate better, and the more they've done, more it reasons to see that you possibly end up with exactly what you want in the end. Another one I've seen is knowledge of your system. Is that important to you? Is it important for you to bring somebody on that's already aware of how your system works, how your people work, how your council or members of your public, those types of previous knowledge? If that's important to you, you can list that in your RFP as a scoring criteria. It really comes down to what is important to you. What are the qualifications that you feel is most important for your engineer? Maybe it's, you know, their ability to listen to staff. So I would ask in the RFP, you know, give me some examples where you've heard and listened to staff input, or what's your process for soliciting and incorporating staff input into your project. You get to determine what qualifications are important to you, and I think that's the key thing to remember. We'll kind of talk about it in the next process, but or in the next slide. But the RFP process is really yours to own and make it work for you. Most LPAs and even a lot of the consultants have come to have a hate-hate relationship with the RFP process. From the agency side, the process can be hard to understand and clunky to meet all the requirements. And especially hard to understand when and where in the process there's a cost-benefit evaluation. Here are some of the common struggles that I see that that our local public agencies have with the process. The first, as I've mentioned, they just let their lawyers develop the RFP, which this ultimately ends up being, hey, your lawyer developed a template 30 years ago, and now we just basically it's a copy and paste. And many times these are very generic RFPs, and so you get generic responses, which makes it extra difficult to really evaluate and score and make the process meaningful. So it deters people from wanting to move forward with it. The next is as I've talked about before, that the local agencies don't take the time to really determine the desired qualifications they want from the consulting engineering firm for the project. You know, each project may be different. You may have a different set of qualifications. You may have learned something from your previous experience, your previous project, or even talking to your buddy down the road. What really are what's important for you guys to make sure this project kicks off right, and making sure that those work into those RFP templates that, like I said, a lot of times are just copy and paste jobs. For sure, the RFP process takes time and can impact the project timeline. So if you get behind the 8 ball with respect to a funding deadline, and the RFP process can take 30 to 60 days and longer if done correctly, that can really have an impact on it. So people tend to want to avoid it simply because of that. One of the things too is, as I've talked to folks, reading and ranking the proposals can be very time consuming. It can be boring. It probably is as boring as listening to me talk about this process, but that again can be a deterring factor in people wanting to really make the process meaningful. And like I said, letting price be the default selection criteria. I think it's easy and comfortable, so they just get down to it of, hey, just I don't care about all these details or what you've done or what you haven't done. Just ask 3 people for a price and we'll just go with the cheapest one. And that ultimately doesn't get you where you want to go. As I mentioned, the role that the potential engineering cost or fee plays in the selection process can be confusing. After all, it is what we're most comfortable with, and it's a very objective and simple evaluation, right? How much is this going to cost me? And then you can decide if it's what you want or not. That's partially the problem, is many times at the beginning of the project we don't know what we want. We have a general idea, but instead of buying a car, we're asking somebody to design a car. And really, it comes down to the features you want in that car and the creativity you associate with that design. So that's why, and this is why the laws are written like they are, where price is a secondary consideration, is because of the role that price of your design ultimately plays into it. So the APWA estimates that for typical public works projects, the amount of money spent on planning and design usually equates to less than 2% of the total project cost when constructions and operations and maintenance are factored in. So what is often overlooked in this initial process, because agencies tend to get focused on how much is it going to cost me, is that it comes down to the value that 2% cost really drives the other 98% of what that project is ultimately going to cost you. It is, and so do you really want to focus on cost, or do you want to focus on what it is you need and what it is that you want and can afford at that 2% level, so that construction goes smoothly, construction is ultimately something that you can afford to build, and then more importantly something that you can afford to maintain, and that the project will last throughout its desired life cycle. You don't want potentially to skimp on your engineering hoping to get a 20% or 20-year project, only turns out it works for 15 years. At that point there's nothing you can do, right? So what does the typical RFP process look like? Most of you are probably familiar with this, but for those that aren't, I'll just kind of go through it. So initially you're going to develop your RFP. This is really where you're going to determine what qualifications that you really want to find in your engineer might be, and get those into your RFP. Next, you'll advertise your RFP, usually your local paper, but getting it out, talking to consultants ahead of time, letting them know that it's coming is a good way, is probably the best way to do it, because those that are interested will keep up with you and know what to expect. Next is once it's out there, you're going to get them back, and then you're going to review and rank the proposals. You conduct interviews, and then this is where scope and ultimately fee come into play. And this is, you will develop the scope and the fee with the top ranked firm. At that point, you'll sit down with them. This is where you really talk about what your desires of the project are, what you want to have happen, what your cost expectations are, what your budgets may or may not be, and really this is where you can decide, are you getting the value that you're hoping for at that point in time. That's where you do your cost value analysis. Many times people think that this is, well, you're just giving the engineer a blank check and I am forced to use the top ranked one. That's absolutely not the case. If you can't agree on a scope and fee, you don't feel that what it's costing you is not what the value is, you simply move on to the next ranked consulting engineer. And in most cases, you will find that 1 and 2 and 3 of those top firms are usually right there as far as qualifications go. And so you would move on and continue negotiations with that next firm. Yes, it may take a little longer, but in the end, you are more likely to end up with a scope and fee that it provides the best long-term value for what it is you're trying to accomplish, right? So another way that you might be able to go about assessing value earlier in the RFP process is don't be afraid to share your budget or estimated budget for engineering in the RFP. Agencies are often afraid to say what their design or planning budgets may be. It's the perception that if you tell a consultant you have $100,000 to spend, that they'll find a way to spend it. That, my friends, is very, very true. But it's actually what you want, because that's the way you're able to squeeze absolutely all the value out of that initial engineering effort. And just kind of for notes, that design engineering fees are typically 8 to 10% of the construction cost. Most of the time, every firm, every engineer is going to fall somewhere within that realm. More complicated projects, maybe a little more. Simpler projects, straightforward projects will probably be less. But that kind of helps give you an idea of what that may be. If you don't know what, I think most of the time you have an idea of the scale of what that of what size of project you're working on. What I would suggest, or something you might consider, is that during the RFP process, if you put your budget in the RFP, ask the consultants to respond and say if they think that's budget's adequate enough to do a complete design and be able to get all the details that you will need in order to get the project built right. And then during the interview process, which I think are often underutilized, and I'll talk slightly more about that later, but ask them to come prepared to present a scope during the interview process, so you can get a better feel for what the consultant's going to deliver, and you can assess if you're getting the value. Because remember, it's the 2% up here. You don't want to try to save a whole, much of the 2% of the overall 98% of the project. The public's best interest is to get that good engineer and the qualified engineer that's going to be able to be creative enough and have the experience to be sure that your project's going to perform like you want it to, and ultimately is going to save you and the agency and the public many more times what the engineering cost you during the construction as compared to the construction and the operations and maintenance, right? Just a few details left out of the design can create very, very costly change orders during construction, and possibly even really increase what it costs you to operate your plant later. Time is money, right? We've all heard this, and most of us have seen why the saying is widely accepted as a truth. This is especially true in the consulting world. The more time your consulting engineer can spend on your project, the more detailed and more creative your design will be. A more detailed design will likely get you better construction bids from better contractors and fewer change orders during construction. Remember, bad contractors don't like detailed plans and specifications. A more creative design will also save on construction costs, but will likely have much more of a cost savings impact on operations, maintenance, and the overall project's life expectancy. There is really no secret sauce in the consulting world. All consultants sell the same raw materials or goods, and that really is time, hours, and minutes. Yes, our hourly rates can vary significantly, but that variance is largely based upon experience and specialization. I'm not saying that the most expensive engineer will always give you the best for your particular project, or will be the best engineer for that particular project. But what I am saying is that in most cases, taking the extra time to assess the engineer's qualifications that you feel are important to the project will go much further to ensuring your project performs over its expected lifetime, and it will ultimately be in the public's best interest. So we're coming to an end of our time together, which I'm sure none of you are very disappointed to hear. And I thought I'd just go through a quick summary of some of the ideas that we've talked about up to this point as far as how to make your RFP and your procurement processes a little more meaningful. So the first one is work with legal counsel that understands QBS laws. Be sure that they understand there's a difference between the process you go through to hire a plumber or buy your toilet paper versus how you go about procuring for your engineering services. Going along with that, be cautious when seeking advice from funding agencies for your RFPs requirements. They may be aware of some requirements but not aware of others, or the difference between the state and the federal laws. Just be cautious there, and ultimately if you refer back to legal counsel or work with legal counsel that understands the QBS laws, you'll be just fine there. Spend time determining what a qualified consultant looks like for your particular organization or agency, or even just the specific project. What's worked well for you in the past, what hasn't worked well for you. How do you build those? Consider how you build those qualifications into your RFP. Make sure that you score them appropriately and set the right weight for those scores as you rank them. But it can be different. It can be different by project, and it doesn't have to be the same for each agency or organization. Don't get too focused on the engineering fee too early in the process. It certainly comes in at the end, but you will be best served if your focus is on finding that consultant that you can work well with, that understands what you want to do and ultimately what you can afford, and working with them to develop a fee at the appropriate time when both you and the consultant understand the scope of the project. One way to kind of compare value or compare the quality that you get from engineering firms is to focus on deliverables rather than hourly fees or hourly rates. You know, ask for some examples of drawings from similar projects. See how detailed they are. See how easy and clear they are to understand, because that will translate to savings in your construction cost. If the contractors can read and understand the plans easy, and they're complete, and they're air-free, and the specifications line up, you'll get far better bids than if the contractors have to guess, or the risk goes up because the plans and specifications are vague. Educate your councils on the value of a qualified consultant. Often they too don't understand the differences between QBS laws and public contracting laws, and everything is just a low bid scenario, because that's how public agencies show best value for the public, right? That's the most common perception. It's just not right in this case. And so working with them to understand that there are two different laws, and the laws do allow you to make sure you're getting your right firm first, as opposed to necessarily having or being required to choose the cheapest of whatever that service you may be looking for from your engineer. One idea too is to engage several consultants before you develop your RFP. We're all happy to come out and talk to you about your project, kick the dirt, share some ideas, all at no cost typically, and can be a great resource for you as you put that RFP together, and also give you an idea on what kind of costs for both projects and engineering fees you might expect. Another idea too that you might consider doing is to issue on-call RFPs, engineer of record RFPs, or roster RFPs to reduce the number of RFPs you write, issue, and evaluate. In some cases, I've seen agencies that feel like they have to issue an RFP every time they are trying to hire a consultant or for each and every project, but that's not the case. ODOT doesn't do it that way. They develop a list of qualified engineers, and then when a project comes up, they go through a mini RFP process where the RFP is very short, specific to that project, and then conduct interviews. And it makes the process and the contracting process a whole lot faster. An engineer of record is where for a period of time you just retain the services for the engineer. There's no guarantee of work or anything. It just means that you can have them do or perform multiple projects during that time and not have to issue an RFP. Typically it's from 3 to 5 years. Roster RFPs are similar. You might have 4 or 5 consultants on a list that you just pick from for various projects. I've seen some cities have a wastewater firm, a water firm, and a transportation firm. Then they just kind of divvy out their projects that way. The other thing you could do is, I would suggest that you really take advantage of the interview process for selection. Simplify your RFPs, and then really bring in the project manager, ask them some of the tough questions, ask them for how they might be creative on your project, ask them how they're gonna be sure to get the long-term value and best performance value for the public, and make sure that there's somebody you can really work with and trust. And I think the best way to do that, as I've seen it, is through the interview process. And many times that doesn't happen because it's by the time you get to that stage in the RFP, you're tired of the whole thing. You just want it to be done. And going along with that is make sure you take the time to do reference checks, and do those checks as it lines up with the qualifications that you feel are important. Don't ask just did they do a good job, but specifically ask how they interacted with you, did they listen to you, or whatever the qualifications and the things that are important to you are, and be sure to seek those out, and specifically on projects where that project manager did the work, because that will tell you, I think, past performance is really the best way to evaluate future performance, I think, is kind of the saying, and that's certainly a good way to do it. So kind of wrapping up here, we're here to help, right? And trust me, we're an engineer. I'm not an engineer, but I certainly work with a bunch of them, and we really do enjoy working with you folks and helping you solve. And I think that speaks for most firms, that tackle your problems and make things better. Don't hesitate. My contact information's on here. I'd certainly be happy to visit with any one of you, share ideas. Certainly a lot of what I shared today was my perspective, and happy to debate or further talk to any of you about some of these ideas as you move forward, and happy to be a resource for you. So with that, I hope you're enjoying your conference. Look forward to actually getting to be with you guys in person in the near future, and wish you all the best of luck on your projects. Thanks.